What's going on, guys? TG or Thundergod here, and today I am covering a pretty interesting Naruto matchup. Today I'm going to be talking about Sasuke versus Neji in the Chunin exams. This is definitely one of the most smoke-heavy Naruto matchups, and although it's been done on the platform before, I've been unsatisfied with the level of analysis with this matchup, myself included, and wanted to talk about a lot of my updated opinions today. You guys know the vibes, we can just get right into the video. And I'm going to just speak for the trees for just a second and say we could all unanimously agree that Sasuke, before his fight with Gaara, is probably just getting swept. Now, Sasuke is pretty strong. He's actually in the top 4 of the Genin. The chapter synopsis statement from chapter 85 actually does say that Naruto, Neji, Lee, and Sasuke are at the top 4, which is pretty consistent, especially since Naruto and Sasuke were both nerfed heavily during their fights in the prelims. Neji at this point is pretty clearly above this. There are 7 statements across anime profiles, fanbook, databook, the manga, and the 10th anniversary guide.
I get it!
That Neji is either the strongest or hailed as the strongest Genin. This matchup should be self-explanatory. We obviously more so care about Sasuke in the second round of the Chunin exams. The one with the new fit, the Gucci button up, all that. So we can just, I think, move on. I think we can all agree on this. If you disagree, I mean, just stick around, I guess. But, I mean, yeah. Now, talking about Sasuke first, pretty self-explanatory, a lot of stuff. He's pretty much stated to be about as fast as Weightless Lee. And about can actually be a little bit faster, a little bit slower. There's not really a clarification on that. But it seems that there just isn't enough a discernible speed gap to just say Sasuke is, in a completely different tier than Lee. It seems pretty blatant that they're just the same speed. It's pretty hard to put that Sasuke above that Neji just due to him being the same speed as Weightless Lee, because it just gets into Lee himself thinking that Neji is stronger than him. The only way you could possibly say this version of Sasuke would be above Neji is that you put Weightless Lee above this same Neji, which kind of contradicts Lee's own statements about Neji's strength. And I'll touch on Neji in a second, how he directly compares to this. How does Lee generally compare to Neji? Well, base Lee is actually just faster than Neji, and Neji's main speed stats come from mainly reaction and striking speed, and he's not able to run around in a similar manner to Lee. This being supplemented with Lee being stated to have unrivaled super speed. Again, you would argue this is referencing his base rather than Lee just being the fastest in the Chunin exams with his gates. The statement for Lee is also extremely relevant, specifically being stated on chapters 109 to 117. And if you're a normal person and don't know exactly what fight that is off the chapters I just said, it's the Shikamaru versus Tamari fight. This is either referencing Lee with his gates, or it's going under the idea that Lee has unrivaled super speed when looking at it outside of a combat scenario. As Lee's speed is said or shown to be superior, at least when he's running around, but in terms of combat speed, he wouldn't be faster than Neji. He would really be only faster than Neji in his ability to run around the battlefield. And even if Lee's combat speed scales to this, which it does, there'd be no Lee literally fights at this speed, Neji would still be greater in terms of close quarters, and this goes in line with some of the stuff I'm going to talk about in a second. But long story short, it kind of means that Lee is faster if we were taking them having a foot race. But the minute that Lee actually does try to get close and enters Neji's close quarters range, that's when Neji's striking speed, reaction speed, and just overall combat speed would be faster, which again is consistent with some of the stuff we're going to talk about in a second. Neji in close quarters would be much closer to Lee with his reverse lotus, as the answer to defeating Neji, guy notes during his fight with Gaara, is in this high speed combo. It is a continuous high speed taijutsu that can't even be touched. Basically being this taijutsu that Lee would be bouncing Neji around the wall and would never be getting touched, so Neji would never really have the opportunity to just shut down Lee's tenketsu. Side point for people who say Lee doesn't use ninjutsu and stuff like that, he still has a chakra network, and the chakra network is directly intertwined with organs. So Neji's gentle fist is still just KOing Lee, you know what I mean? So now it's noted that the reverse lotus opens up as far as the 3rd gate in the data book, with guys supplementing this by saying opening the 3rd gate, one can begin the reverse lotus. Now, a lot of confusion comes about because Lee also notes while I'm at it, he's going to open the 4th gate, but he realistically only needed the 3rd gate to actually use the reverse lotus. And Kakashi's kind of convinced on this, as after he opens the 3rd gate, he's going to make his move. So guy's statement about the reverse lotus is more than likely referencing only up to the 3rd gate, as he's referencing the technique itself with the additional gate amps that Lee uses not being necessary for the reverse lotus to be used. You could potentially insinuate some more gates may have been needed against Neji, as Lee kind of notes this move I was keeping in reserve for you. But Lee is more so mentioning the move he uses where he wraps his bandages around Gaara and whips him back, which kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, where it just being a high speed combo and him just essentially putting Neji in a position where he would never be able able to use his taijutsu. You could potentially infer that Lee's referencing the 5th gate, which is, you know, what he uses before he just does the move I just described. However, this is not necessary for the reverse lotus, and this is more so something he did as a result of Gaara's just durable defenses. Durable defenses? Call me Double D. What type of statement was that? Long story short, it essentially means that due to how the reverse lotus functions, it essentially puts, like, you look at it like this. It either requires the 3rd gate to just beat Neji, or Lee had to use like more than like the 3rd gate, or like add on to the reverse lotus with the additional gates off of like the statements in the fight to just overcome Neji. It essentially just puts Neji in this weird like 3rd gate plus, 4th gate potentially range, depending how you interpret it. But that is the bare minimum for the reverse lotus, which is the combo that was going to be needed to beat Neji. Regardless of which interpretation you go off of, it's just pretty clear that base Sasuke would not be at this level, again, with his like combat speed or anything like that. If he tried to do what he did against Gaara and just run up and try and taijutsu Neji, he would obviously get throttled pretty badly. There's also other arguments like Neji actually training between the time of this match and like his Chunin exams match with Naruto, possibly making it that this threshold isn't even relevant to the Neji that fights Naruto later on. If you want to supplement this, in Naruto Retsuden, Naruto can't use chakra for a certain point of the story, and Oro shows up to his home with this Byakugan device that Naruto essentially needs to learn how to use. And through a series of events, he comes across like Neji's old training logs, and in it notes that Neji never skipped a day of training on his own. He was a genius. He worked tirelessly and was harder on himself than anybody else. Which, if you tie back to Neji actually training before the Chunin exams, you may actually be able to make an argument that there were some pretty substantial growth increases. It's really not measurable by any metric, but like if you put a lot of stock into that, then there you go. So to close off this weightless Lee section, I just want to talk about some different avenues that you could potentially pursue to maybe get these characters higher or lower. One metric that people use is the Kimimaro fight. Now, what we know from the Kimimaro fight is that Lee is just objectively weaker than his Chunin exams counterpart. The problem comes in due to Drunken Lee actually just doing well against Kimimaro, or doing well to a degree, with his unorthodox fighting style being noted twice, but his speed also being noted to be somewhat problematic for Kimimaro. Definitely implying that the Drunken Fist does have somewhat of a strength increase on top of the unorthodox fighting style that Lee gains. Now, I'm of the opinion that Drunken Lee is mainly unorthodox, and that the speed increase and the strength increase he got isn't really that substantial, so it doesn't really work to say Lee is that much stronger than everybody else. Kimimaro mainly noting that Lee's moves are hard to predict, and that's when he uses the curse marks power, which he does mention twice, compared to Lee being fast only kind of being an afterthought after his initial point of Lee just being hard to predict. So it's clearly more of a pressing point than Lee's speed itself. I'm gonna start off by saying this: using Lee here and just taking his feats and trying to upscale any Chunin exam characters doesn't really work, because it's very circular, because we know Neji gets stronger, fights someone stated in the chapter title and in Neji's own opinion as stronger than, you know, the version of Naruto that he was fighting in the exams. Kidomaru that Neji fights being below Kimimaro, or at least it's implied. You might actually be able to say Kimimaro's strength is a little more variable since he's a much more degraded version, but Kabuto does think that nobody who could have been put against Kimimaro would have really been able to stop him, so he still thinks Kimimaro is pretty insane. Naruto, who had gone through chakra control training, raising his overall stats via the Rasengan training, can match pre and post Coffin or like Sasuke's amped base form. Also just uses the Kyuubi's chakra to fight Kimimaro and loses, but then here comes Drunken Lee. You know what I'm saying? It doesn't really work, which is also why I add that the unorthodox point is the biggest one, especially since Kimimaro only taps into a little bit of the curse marks chakra to really overcome the unorthodox fighting style Lee has. Kimimaro doesn't use the full curse mark one. He actually does a partial transformation. People forget that Kimimaro's curse mark control is on a similar level to heavy Sasuke's, but he essentially just does this so he can get the ribs like popping out of him, and then he just blatantly is able to react to Lee trying the primary lotus on him, closing his ribs and then catching Lee's foot. This is why I say that the Drunken Fist is main issue for Kimimaro, and why he knows like he has no choice is due to the unorthodox nature of it and how Kimimaro can't really just predict or deal with Lee's movements, even though he's taking no damage. So he just taps into a little bit of the curse marks power, not even a full version 1. The full version 1 he only does versus Gaara when he gets trapped into sand burial, but he just uses a little bit of the curse marks power. Now, if you're wondering why he did this, this is because a common trend with Kimimaro and the other Sound 4 ninja is that they gain more of their latent abilities as they use more of the curse mark, which is why he enters a little bit of the curse mark, so he could just gain the ability to shoot out his ribs and then protrude bones all over his body to that extent. This is the same with the other Sound ninja and their higher stages of the curse mark. They all gain specific attributes. I've talked about this a lot more in depth in other videos, so I just won't go through it here. But essentially, Kimimaro just gained a little bit of chakra. He did gain a strength increase, although it's not a straight multiplier, as that's not how the curse mark works. It's a chakra multiplier, not a straight stat multiplier. Along with the other reasons that Lee being this strong and just saying like Neji from the Chunin exams or anything to that degree, it doesn't work. Yeah, you could pick this up. It does not work. I just figured I'd address that as I don't put too much stock into that. Even like base Sasuke fighting the Sound 4, you could imply is a bit stronger in the Chunin exams one, as we actually do know he was training post Chunin exams before his interaction with Itachi. If you want to argue that's counteracted by his coma, by all means. It's possible he was getting hatred amped as well, but even then, that fight doesn't really work because the Sound 4 use substitutions, and then Sasuke does Lion's Barrage on Sakon, but obviously it doesn't work because he switches out with Ukon, and then he just loses straight up. Just figured I'd touch on all of that. The only other argument I would bring up, or potential case I could see for like maybe swinging this one way or the other, is that Gaara was potentially mental debuffed or in a state where he's not fighting at his absolute peak or at optimal levels, dealing with the mysterious headaches that Gaara gets when he's excited. This being displayed in his interaction with Naruto and Shikamaru in the hospital when he goes to just assassinate Lee, where Shikamaru possesses Gaara and like he's not able to move, which shouldn't have any impact on his automatic sand defense, yet the sand defense doesn't activate and Naruto's just able to clock Gaara. This is weird just because, you know, his sand defense isn't really reliant on his physical movement, so like, why didn't it activate? You could interpret it a number of ways. Like, maybe Gaara was using, like, because he was manually taking control of his sand, in order to just choke out Lee, it kind of overrided the automatic sand defense. That's my interpretation, at least. I don't think there's too much stock in the whole Gaara being mentally debuffed argument, just because these symptoms are never seen again. Like, the headaches come back, but the whole, like, sand not really moving point, it's never prevalent. Like, this is like a one-off type thing. So I personally don't have too much stock into this small point. There's just not really too much to bite down on here. Now, if we factor in the Sharingan, this does change the matchup, because realistically, right, if Sasuke's aware that Neji's a close quarters fighter, he's going to make it a point not to get close to Neji. Sasuke does have a pretty decent arsenal of ranged ninjutsu to keep Neji away or keep away from Neji's close quarters, with his arsenal of fire style ninjutsu ranging from the Phoenix Flower, Fireball, or Dragon Flame Jutsu. Now, while this wouldn't take out Neji, as Neji would just clearly see the buildup of chakra in Sasuke's mouth, or like, you know, the chakra building up to his throat in a similar fashion to when he's fighting Kidomaru and sees Kidomaru building the chakra up, getting ready to spit his chakra webbing, it would again just make it so that Neji isn't able to just advance and like blitz Sasuke from across the battlefield, which isn't how Neji fights in character. He actually lets his opponent come to him, or only really advances on them if they're a lot closer towards him. The way I would look at it is like Neji's 64 palms range is like a sea bear circle. That's where he's going to try and get you in, whether you come to him or you're in a close enough distance to where he can go there. We don't want to enter the sea bear circle. If Sasuke enters the sea bear circle, it's cooked. GG, click X, next video. Sasuke's Sharingan would also make it that he's probably not just going to get blitzed from long distances by Neji, as Sasuke, when his Sharingan was active versus Gaara, was able to perceive his movements through prediction, and still able to be relative enough to like the prediction speed to be able to block close quarter strikes from said Gaara, along with just being able to shoot fireballs out before Gaara hits him. Now, there's more to this transform Gaara that I'm going to talk about when I get to some later stuff with Sasuke, so just hold on there. But Sasuke will be able to check Neji's advance a bit with the ranged fire style ninjutsu, which Neji would more than likely respond to with rotation. And I do think rotation will be able to block it. Going to talk about that in a second as well. So the main thing for the Sharingan is that it just kind of ensures Sasuke isn't just getting outright blitzed from long distances, helps predict Neji's movements from a distance, along with being able to just keep a distance via Lee's speed. And although this does take a stamina toll on Sasuke, it doesn't really matter because fire style or Lee's taijutsu doesn't give Sasuke a win here inherently anyway. Last thing I'll touch on is if the Sharingan actually amps Sasuke from a stat perspective, it kind of changes the threshold I just discussed. We have statements such as ones from the data book that note that one's ability is significantly improved in all kinds of aspects with the Sharingan, coupled with anime profile statements such as the effects of his own jutsu increase dramatically when used in tandem with the Sharingan, along with general statements such as when a ninja's Kekkei Genkai awakens, his fighting power increases dramatically, which isn't exclusive to Sasuke because Neji also would get that same kind of buff with the Byakugan if you made that case. It's kind of tough to say. My opinion is that if you do want to give it to him, I think that's fine. I just don't think it closes enough of like a stat disparity between Neji's close quarters range and like Sasuke's close quarters range. Like, even if Sasuke's able to visualize Neji's movements, he still has to be close enough in terms of speed to actually react and do something about it, or relative to a degree. The kinetic vision offered by the Sharingan, which is the ability to read movement, will pretty much be the main thing that's aiding him here. While the stat, you know, stuff can be argued, I just wouldn't put too much stock into it. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's no like Sasuke doesn't activate his Sharingan and is suddenly a rival to Gated Lee. You know what I'm saying? That's no. Which does lead us into talking about rotation, how that deals defensively against Sasuke's Fireball Jutsu and Father Fire Style, along with Sasuke's trump card, which is probably one of the biggest parts of this discussion, that being Chidori versus rotation. Now, rotation's weird because it's oddly like hyped up by a lot of people. Dudes would have you thinking this is the same as Gojo's Limitless. Other people are just like, it's dookie garbage. I have my own opinions on it. Let's talk about it. How Chidori interacts with it. How Chidori scales in, relativity to that. What's going on Chidori versus rotation? Let's talk about it. Starting off with rotation, the biggest thing people point to is 10-10 statement, with rotation being a defense or a kind of absolute defense, even more powerful than Gaara's. Now, a lot of dudes have called cap on this statement because A, 10-10 is a mega Neji glazer. And on top of that, she hasn't seen Gaara fight and was off screen. But realistically, you could just make up an excuse and say like Neji told her about the sand, or there's some reason she knows, like not a good one, but you could just say like she's been told about it, and from her interpretation Neji's defense is better. But you can kind of throw the whole like 10-10 idea, like oh she doesn't know, like out the window, because the data book actually makes a similar note directly noting that on the 8 trigrams Palm's revolving heaven, or just rotation, it quote, it stands in the same league as Gaara's sand as an ultimate protection, and was even called the other absolute defense, end quote. So even if you call cap on 10-10 statement, which admittedly you should, because Kishimoto really didn't think about the logistics of that statement, it's kind of like just an unreliable narrator. With the data book supplementation, it's one of those things that was just like 10-10's just filling in the narrator role. She's just basically saying this in the story, and Kishimoto definitely wasn't thinking about that. But it's pretty clear that this is consistent with the data book, and she's just kind of like the person he pulled out of a hat to give the dialogue. It could have been anybody. Compare this to Chidori, which blatantly is shown just piercing through Gaara's sand defense, or sand sphere. The sand sphere Gaara goes into when he's doing the playing possum jutsu actually just scales outright above like his regular sand defense that Neji's defense or rotation is being compared to. So you essentially have Sasuke just outright piercing through a higher grade of defense than the one that Neji has been like compared to. So even though Neji's rotation does stand in the same league as Gaara's sand, Sasuke's Chidori scales to a higher grade of defense than that league that was previously set, and just pierces through it. So from an AP perspective, there's no real reason like Neji's rotation should just scale to this higher grade of defense for Gaara. This level of sand density just never being shown or seen in the series up until this point. This is all also supplemented with the synopsis statement when Sasuke actually does pierce through the sandball, which reads as followed: pierce it, target the absolute defense, and pierce with an absolute breakthrough power. Sasuke's left hand resorted to a fatal thrust. So not only does it call this like enhanced sandball like the absolute defense instead of like a absolute defense, and goes on to show Chidori's like absolute breakthrough power, which is consistent as Chidori's piercing properties have always been very potent. Now, I've also heard it argued that Sasuke had an elemental advantage versus Gaara's sand, which this is just not the case. Gaara's sand is never stated to be earth release. It's really only noted to be weak to like oil, like in Getsu's oil like water. The Raikage guillotine drops on Gaara's sand and it doesn't dissolve or anything like that. So yeah, it's not weak to lightning release or anything to that degree. Gaara's sand is actually a bit more complex than just having an elemental weakness. With it even being discussed in Gaara Heated that Ross had come up with a technique where he takes hydrated calcium and volcanic rock from underground water, mixing it with a water jutsu to essentially turn any sand defense or sand attack that he's like forced up against into just concrete. And this is obviously like swapped out when Rasa just figures out a much better way to deal with Shukaku's attack, that being the gold dust to weigh it down. But yeah, just slapping an elemental weakness on Gaara's sand doesn't really work. It's much more complex than that. And this whole thing essentially puts Sasuke in good standing for him to shred right through rotation, as Sasuke Chidori would just either blatantly scale to a higher grade of defense, or you'd have to just say like rotation is in the same like league as Gaara's sand sphere, which is not as likely due to the statements given about it, or like before Gaara exhibits the technique. The main questionable part of this is how rotation fundamentally functions and how that interacts with Chidori. The rotation is a taijutsu where one releases a large amount of chakra from their body's tenketsu to catch the blows from the enemy's attack while making one's body spin to repel them. Tenta remarks how Neji does his rotation. He spins around a circle, blocking and repelling his opponent's chakra, meaning that Neji has some way to deal with chakra-based techniques. The problem is that there's not an actual way to quantify the upper limits of what Neji can actually repel chakra-wise, as Naruto had previously just canceled out the technique, not even like clashing with it in the anime. His raw chakra interacts with the rotation and he actually wins the clash. The force of his chakra is what won him that clash. So the only example of rotation actually attempting this it fails at. The aftermath of this clash isn't any better for Neji, as Naruto actually has enough strength to burrow his way under the ground, create a shadow clone, and then uppercut and one-shot Neji. This, along with the post-fight interaction, and Naruto just like hopping in a happy mood off the battlefield, whereas even when Hiashi goes to visit Neji, he's like barely able to even sit up, you know what I'm saying? He's still laid out on the stretcher. The only possible way this could scale higher is if you argue maybe like Naruto's mental amped off of the statement of him getting stronger every time he mentions he's going to become Hokage, but like, what does this get you? Neji lost the clash anyway, you know what I mean? And it really doesn't contradict like the previous argument I just made. It's pretty consistent that Chidori be this strong as well, as Naruto, even after fighting Neji, feels somewhat insecure about seeing Sasuke Chidori. He also goes on a journey with Jiraiya when he's kind of lured in with the idea of learning a technique actually stronger than Chidori. Like, that was kind of his reasoning going with Jiraiya. Something interesting as well is that Orochimaru blatantly thinks that Naruto is no match for Sasuke. Like, he kind of chides Jiraiya on this. Like, the Uchiha are naturally gifted with the Sharingan, and that boy has no hope of winning because Naruto just doesn't have it. So even off of seeing Naruto's like feats with the Kyuubi chakra, he still thinks Sasuke with the Sharingan is greater. Although granted, like, Orochimaru is kind of on Sasuke's meat, so this may not be the best metric, and it kind of goes more so into Orochimaru and Jiraiya kind of discussing their shinobi philosophy as opposed to like some objective like power statement. I just did want to throw this in. Next up, I want to talk about Chidori's speed and how this interacts with like rotation and Neji speed in general. Now, there's two interpretations for Chidori. You're either under the interpretation that it more so raises the user to a like max speed for the user and doesn't amplify the individual speed, or it just, you know, amplifies the individual speed under certain circumstances. I'll start off with this. I'm under the latter interpretation, and that is what I'm going to be going with for the video, and it'll kind of like address some of the former stuff. But if you are under the former interpretation and think Chidori is just like as fast as Sasuke's like regular speed with just, you know, a Chidori in hand, then you don't really need to like peep what I'm saying. You just keep it. The whole idea behind Chidori as a technique is that most individuals are unable to utilize it, as they pretty much just get tunnel vision when they're utilizing the technique and are very susceptible to counter blows, which is why it only really comes about when paired with the kinetic vision offered by the Sharingan, essentially allowing the user to see what's going on around them and just counter accordingly, even from a close range, which was the problem with Kakashi using the technique previously. I'll also add that Kakashi's version of Chidori and Sasuke's are literally the same, so this should just transfer over. Kakashi at this point obviously didn't change the technique to Raikiri. It didn't go up one rank and go from like the A rank jutsu that Sasuke uses in Kakashi to the S rank that like Jonin Kakashi uses, like, or as an adult, because he's a Jonin back then. Chidori and Raikiri are not fundamentally, they are the same technique, with Raikiri just being a little stronger. I know some people bring up the obvious rank difference, which you can interpret a couple different ways, but it doesn't really change any of the fundamentals of how the technique operates. Some people point to the fact that Raikiri takes 3 hand signs while Chidori takes a bunch more. This is not true. This is just anime Jabba Jabba. The data book lists both as taking 3 hand signs. Sasuke also just doing the exact same hand signs as Kakashi. A lot of discussion comes in with Guy's explanation of the technique, which doesn't really imply it's like this increase in speed, but more so just like the max speed of the individual. As Guy notes, Sasuke had to build his speed up to even use the technique, so it's fair to see why people would take this stance. However, I am under the opinion that Chidori does increase speed under certain conditions. I'm going to talk about those conditions in a sec, because it's not always the case. We have a couple reasons for this. A, Minato's, you know, explanation of the technique supersedes Guy's in the manga, and they don't directly contradict each other. So you have a later explanation of the technique kind of clarifying what it does, but this is taken a step further in Boruto, where an on-guard Boro would move his core if he's aware Boruto and Kon want to attack it. So Sarada surmises she needs an attack faster than Boro can weave signs. In order to achieve this, Sarada resorts to using Chidori, as she notes it is an attack faster than the hand sign weaving speed, with Boro noting that she's too fast, having her just beat down her, Mitsuki, Kawaki, and Boruto pretty handily at this point. Mitsuki also supplementing this by noting Chidori is a high-speed thrust attack where you concentrate chakra into your hand and then release it. Mitsuki would then go on to note that it's so fast that it's hard to have accurate aim for it with the jutsu, only being feasible if you have the Sharingan. So you essentially have 2 later interpretations or like explanations of the technique, giving off the idea that it's just shooting like the individual too fast where they need the Sharingan and are getting tunnel vision, compared to Guy's explanation, which doesn't really give off that vibe. So even if you wanted to like argue the definitions against one another, the Minato and like Boruto stuff just come later on in the timeline and should just like take precedence, in my opinion, over the Guy stuff, as not only do they come later, so they're more accurate representations of the technique, but also it's the more consistent explanation being said twice. This being supplemented with material material like Kakashi's note on Raikiri on the 10th anniversary guide, where it notes, it pierces the target with unstoppable speed. It has said that the palm of it can even cut through lightning. Now, I want to make something clear. While I do think Raikiri and Chidori amplify speed, I think this is most prevalent when the individual, like Kakashi or Sasuke, has a running start. This is a very similar principle that's done later on with like higher speed movements as well, such as the Lariat with the Raikage and Killer Bee, with their technique being in similar principle where they focus chakra in their arm and their speed being noted to be almost at the speed of light. Now, this is like a mistrans. This isn't exactly, it's more so like light, but what I do want you to understand is that it is like very similar in principle, with these linear moving lightning attacks mainly being amplified in speed when they're moving linearly, when they're like one directional. We see Sasuke can do Chidori standing still while in the air, and like other characters can just keep up with it. It's not really an issue for them. A good one-to-one example is how Naruto can keep up with Chidori while in the air. Yet when Sasuke actually gets a running start in the final valley, Naruto needs to throw himself with the clone to boost his speed to actually match it. I'm not going to go through and just break down every interaction with Chidori, as that would take all day and people really aren't interested to hear that. Or maybe they are, I don't know. But this is the main underlying principle with the technique, and this is going to become relevant when we quantify it in a second. Even the data book for Chidori literally notes that Sasuke activates the body, and furthermore, by running a long distance, he turns into a high-speed stab. So it kind of goes in line with what I was saying, where the Chidori speed increase mainly comes about when Sasuke is just moving linearly over time. The way I always interpreted Guy's statement was that he pretty much needed like a baseline of speed to actually use Chidori, and that was the whole point of him gaining weightlessly speed. And then he was able to further amplify on top of that when he has that running start and is able to move linearly. If Sasuke's like falling in the air with Chidori in his hand, or just like wants to stand still with it, no shit, he's not going to be moving faster, you know? There's nothing to push off of. So that's my little spiel on Chidori increasing speed. I think the evidence is just overwhelming, but I do want people to know it's kind of under specific conditions. So how do these speeds compare to Neji? Well, there isn't really like a linear way to compare it, even if you go off Lee, unless you went with like some previous interpretations like I discussed. So where does Chidori's speed lie exactly in relativity to these fighters? Well, looking at Sasuke's performance against the transformed Gaara in the forest right after the Chunin exams, we actually do see that Sasuke is able to keep up with Gaara's transformed state when he's utilizing Chidori, essentially being displayed at relative speeds. Now, he does this against version 1 and version 2 Gaara. Version 1 Gaara is just the one with the arm, and version 2 is the one with the tail, who is just stated to be faster and stronger. Now, I don't want people to misconstrue this, that Gaara is mainly faster in his second state, although he is stated to be stronger. He's mainly faster due to him actually slingshotting himself. So he grabs like a tree with his arm and his tail, pulls back, and then like lets go, releases the tension, and goes flying forward. This is where his like main speed increase comes from. And the reason this is relevant to distinguish is, although Sasuke keeps pace with version 1 and version 2 Gaara, version 2 Gaara doesn't use his slingshot speed against Sasuke Chidori. He just jumps off the branch regularly like Gaara does in version 1. To muddy the waters further, it's not like Sasuke has a running start either when he's using Chidori. He's actually just jumping in a similar manner to Gaara, also making it so that this Sasuke who's keeping up with this version 1 Gaara is also not reaching his maximum velocity because he's airborne. He's not having that running start, that linear movement to just help him accelerate to his maximum velocity. Sasuke's maximum Chidori speed would more than likely be in some range between the version 1 Gaara and the slingshot and Gaara speed, more than likely closer to the slingshot and Gaara speed, or possibly beyond, as both those movements are only really able to be perceived with the Sharingan, allowing Sasuke to react accordingly, whether against Gaara or while he actually is utilizing Chidori. Chidori could actually be faster, or it could even be slower. We nearly wouldn't be able to just get an exact gauge on it, but the Sharingan being needed to visualize and predict movements at these higher speeds is a pretty good benchmark to compare the two. I will say as well that even though Gaara is moving linearly while slingshotting himself, which does make it easier for Sasuke to perceive his movements, Sasuke is able to react to short-term movements like Gaara just trying to slap him with his claw when he gets close. So his ability to deal with these higher speeds with the Sharingan is pretty consistent again, so I think Chidori following suit is a very safe metric. So above the version 1 Gaara that he was fighting, maybe above, maybe below, we'll just keep him exactly at the version 2 Gaara for a safe metric. But obviously it wouldn't be exactly the same, but you could just assert anything really, and you would, who's gonna say shit? I'm not, you know? How does this compare to Naruto, Neji, in the Chunin exams, and these higher speeds? Does this objectively just make Sasuke faster? It's a little harder to prove than that because there's not a linear scaling chain, right? There's not a linear progression, because the Naruto that fights Gaara is not linkable to the one that fights Neji. Let's just establish something real quick before I talk about Naruto versus Gaara. Naruto thought base Gaara was going to kill him. Let's just start right there. He thought he was going to get cooked by base Gaara. Both him and Shikamaru just note before Sasuke's fight that if it had been done before like the Chunin that were messing with Gaara, they were cooked. So Naruto's not stronger than base Gaara in base, all right? Gaara literally just slaps Naruto away at his initial, like, blitz or just jump at Gaara. Along with Gaara just outright noting that he's going to play around with Naruto without letting him die. Even Naruto actually placing that tag on Gaara was done via 2 shadow clone, throws that accelerate Naruto. And we actually, you know, like I mentioned previously, Naruto can make himself quite a bit faster by throwing his clone. So he actually does this twice. He does it for the first one to slingshot himself, and then 2 more to pretty much maneuver around Gaara and then place the tag. This should also be pretty evident as Gaara just straight up wants to fight the power that Naruto used to take down Neji. So this should be pretty clear. Now, there is a layer to the Naruto versus Gaara interactions where Naruto, on top of just being afraid of Gaara's strength, Gaara's mindset and philosophy are extremely intimidating to Naruto. The whole idea that Gaara lives for himself, kills for himself, while having a tailed beast inside of him and being completely alone, and a direct foil and mirror to Naruto himself, also adds to Naruto thinking he may not be able to beat Gaara. Gaara's whole purpose at this point in the story was to just kill other humans than himself. You know what I mean? So that mindset was very threatening to Naruto, along with Gaara's strength. Like, I don't think they're mutually exclusive because Gaara has to be strong for this mindset to be intimidating. So this is also at play here. I just do want to note that Naruto does have, like, he's pretty much gone through training to forcibly activate the Kyuubi's chakra and is still just outright terrified of Gaara and still kind of questions his ability to beat him. But again, there's multiple factors at play. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. With Naruto's main, like, showings against Gaara being the result of like an insane mental amp coming from his desire to protect his comrades. This is probably one of the most explicit like mental amp capacities in this series. It just is called back to Haku. Hiruzen supplemented as well in his fight with Orochimaru. This mental amp is so severe that Sasuke just thinks he's outright inferior following this arc, just due to him thinking these mental amp feats are Naruto's regular capabilities. We then see Naruto do the 1,000 shadow clones, which proceeds to just absolutely bulldoze Gaara. Gaara completes possession and then transforms into the full form of Shukaku. Naruto then notes that he pretty much used up all his chakra with those doppelgangers, but then he looks at Sakura and then proceeds to summon Gamabunta. Now, the digital colored version of Naruto actually has Naruto's eye here red with a slit on it. The anime, however, does not follow this, which leads a bit of debate if Naruto actually did use the Kyuubi's chakra here. Naruto's fingers and whiskers also don't show any Kyuubi characteristics here either, pretty much making it very difficult to just pinpoint if it's just like a Kyuubi chakra he's tapping into, or if this is part of his mental amp, or just somewhat of a mix of the two. We do know that the chakra Naruto had in the Chunin exams is above the threshold that's needed to actually summon Gamabunta, but this isn't usable to link back to the Chunin exams because Naruto had used all his chakra in the 1,000 shadow clones, either gets some Kyuubi chakra and has a mental amp, or does one or the other, doesn't really matter, uses up all his chakra again to the point he can't even do a transformation jutsu and needs Gamabunta to lend him chakra. So he's pretty much just getting these unquantifiable amounts of chakra and then wasting them all in one shot, pretty much making it that you can't really use the chakra summoning threshold as a metric. It's just, it's too variable. It doesn't lead anywhere because Naruto's like blowing all his chakra in one shot. I'm also of the opinion this isn't the Kyuubi's chakra that Naruto uses to summon Gamabunta because it's very explicit when Naruto's drawing power from the Kyuubi forcefully like he does in training. As we see when Naruto actually gets caught in Gaara's sand, it has like, it pretty much shows the same thing that it showed in his fight with Neji with like the chakra swirling around his Tenketsu, covering him in the same aura. So that also leads me to believe it wasn't the Kyuubi's chakra that impacted his ability to summon Gamabunta. And even Naruto performing this feat leads back to nowhere because just as quickly as he gets a little chakra to free himself, it goes away with him just headbutting Gaara. So you kind of are getting the picture that it's just like a bunch of Naruto like using up all his chakra, getting a little bit more, and this amount that he gains not really being measurable. The main thing that is presented though is that Naruto's 1,000 shadow clones is just more of a notable increase or more of an amp than the Kyuubi chakra and the Chunin. With everything here, it's presented that Naruto's mental amp is just a more substantial increase against an opponent that has good implications against Naruto himself and Naruto's previous forms. So while I don't go off the interpretation that the Kyuubi chakra Naruto exhibits in the exams is inherently above the mental amp or, you know, the much more transformed Gaara Gaara that is just ragdolling Naruto previously. If you were going to make a case for Naruto in the exams with the Kyuubi chakra, I would personally go off the general anime profile statement, which discusses after hearing about Neji's past, Naruto powers his chakra up stronger than ever, which if you want to take that as a whole and link that back to even like much earlier on in part 1 with Haku and Zabuza, where Naruto powers up against Haku and Kakashi mistakes Naruto's chakra for Zabuza and directly scale that Naruto over that into these like Jonin levels. However, again, we know the Kyuubi characteristics are more so a result of just more of the Kyuubi's chakra. So if you want to put stock into that, you can. However, the following statement also calls Sasuke and Gaara the best of the Leaf and Sand. So it does, even by that metric, if you don't even use the anime profile statements, it doesn't matter. But even if you did, it kind of isn't good anyway. So even if after Naruto goes through this training, performs these massive like outlier feats that he doesn't really perform aside from like maybe his fight with like against Mitsuki in the first chapter, like later on in part 1, still thinking Chidori is this crazy, incredible technique, which kind of adds to the arguments I was presenting earlier. This essentially creates a situation where it's more narratively implied that this Naruto is just stronger than the one in the exams, plus all the statements following it, without there being like an explicit scaling chain just putting them above. Here's the way I look at this matchup. If you look at Sasuke without Chidori, I think Neji's pretty blatantly stronger. He's a more complete fighter. He just has an overwhelming speed edge at close quarters. Whereas Sasuke has weightless lead speeds, kind of run around, fire style to keep Neji at a range, mitigate the distance, pretty much open up a linear attacking Chidori, or if Sasuke just decides to use Chidori at all, which Neji more than likely responds to with rotation. This becoming more consistent with an understanding of the Sharingan, its upper limits, the higher speed Sasuke can reach, all of that. Pretty much whatever stated in the video. That's the way I would look at it, and like if you wanted to give me my opinion, I would probably say like Sasuke 6 to 7 times out of 10, just because I think Chidori is likely. But to say Neji is never getting a W is just disingenuous in my opinion. I think it's very valid, especially if you want to argue off rip he just gets in close on Sasuke. That's just my own personal opinion. Let me know what you guys think down below. If you enjoyed this type of video, why? I would appreciate a like too. A lot of work went into this video. I try to make it stick on the platform, but you know, there's no pleasing everybody, but hopefully you guys enjoyed hearing my perspective, hearing my opinion on the argument. Maybe you learned something, maybe you didn't. Catch you next time. Bye-bye.